You're watching The Verdict on News 15, brought to you by Laborde Earls Injury Lawyers.
On today's edition of The Verdict, we continue with part 2 of Elmo Patrick Sonnier and get a glimpse of his final moments before execution.
Well, the murders were committed in November 1977, on the 5th of November. A month later, the Sonnier brothers were arrested. They bragged about it in Texas, and they were picked up there, brought back to Louisiana, and put on trial. Now, before the trial, when they were both arrested, they each blamed each other for the murders. He pulled the trigger. Elmo said Eddie pulled the trigger. Eddie said Elmo pulled the trigger. What they determined is that Elmo had indeed pulled the trigger.
My dad was a witness because he actually went to the crime scene when they found their bodies, and so they kept him as a witness, so he couldn't stay in for the whole time. So he said I was his ears, you know. And we went through 2 lengthy trials to begin with. And we went to another set. Then they said they had to have a change of venue because the jury in New Iberia was prejudiced because Loretta was from New Iberia and David was from St. Martinville. So we moved it to Franklin.
The trial happened, and Elmo was sentenced to death. Eddie got life in prison. Eddie was the younger brother. And in prison, Sister Helen Prejean became Elmo's spiritual advisor. And they became very close. And he was facing death, and of course Sister Prejean was a Catholic nun and opposed to the death penalty.
And at some point my dad met her, and he criticized her and the church because they were going around to the jails and death row and trying to help these people when murders were happening here and nobody was helping us. And Daddy questioned the church and said, where was the church when we needed help? When David was murdered, 30 days, we had no answers. Where was the church? But this guy's in jail in Angola, and he has all the kind of spiritual assistance that he can get. And my daddy was very annoyed with that. And so the nun came meet my dad and talk to him, and she would come visit him. And I told her, I said, sister, you're a nice person, but I don't believe in what you're doing to this killer, you know. I said, he's evil.
Elmo was sentenced to death. He's on death row, and of course, there's the natural appeals that come up. That's part of our system, is the automatic appeals. And there's always hope for some kind of reprieve. And this went on for quite some time. And Eddie, once Elmo was on death row, began to say, well, I actually did it. And he wrote letters confessing to it. He even wrote Governor Edwards and said, I did it. I'm the one who pulled the trigger. Of course, at that point, it was okay for Eddie to confess because there was no chance of him being resentenced to death. So people didn't believe him. So when all the appeals were exhausted, the last hope would have been some type of commutation of the sentence from Governor Edwards. Well, Governor Edwards called Elmo personally and said he was not going to stay the execution, that it was going to indeed go forward. Elmo Patrick Sonnier was executed in 1984. Now, Sister Helen Prejean was allowed to walk with him to the execution chamber where the electric chair was. And the odd thing about those final moments is that Elmo asked David LeBlanc's father for forgiveness, but did not ask Loretta Bork's father for forgiveness.
And I said, Daddy, how could you forgive this man who murdered your only son and tortured them for hours, him and his girlfriend for hours? How could you forgive him? He said, well, the nuns and the brothers brought me up at school and they taught me the Our Father and to forgive.
Sister Helen Prejean wrote a book in 1993, and later that book became a movie, Dead Man Walking. And so the whole case got an awful lot of attention from the media, and Elmo kind of became a celebrity after death. The sad part about this whole thing is that very few people think about or remember the 2 victims, the 2 teenagers that he murdered. And if you Google them, you'll find one photograph of the victims, scores of photos of Elmo and his brother.
That's it for today's edition of The Verdict. Tune in next time for more crimes along the bayou.
This presentation of The Verdict on News 15 was brought to you by Laborde Earls Injury Lawyers.